Long before the luxury of modern aviation or the predictable convenience of container ships, the global economy depended on a precarious web of dirt tracks, mountain passes, and shifting sand dunes known as the Silk Road. Today, the very name conjures images of romantic caravan journeys, exotic spice markets, and cultural exchanges beneath the minarets of ancient desert oases. It is a cinematic myth, polished by centuries of historical distance and Western fascination. The unvarnished reality, preserved in the anxious letters of medieval merchants, the skeletal remains along the tracks, and the brutal laws of ancient borderlands was a grueling nightmare. To understand the sheer madness of traveling the Silk Road, one must first realize that it was never a single, paved highway. It was a thousands of miles-long maze of fractured paths stretching from the eastern capital of Chang'an in China, through the suffocating deserts of Central Asia, over the freezing heights of the Pamir Mountains, and down to the shores of the Mediterranean. To step onto this trail was to leave behind the protection of centralized empires and enter a vast, lawless zone where nature actively tried to kill you and humanity was often even more vicious. For the average merchant or traveler, a journey across the Silk Road was not a brief expedition. It was a multi-year gamble with death. You did not pack a light suitcase and look forward to sightseeing. You packed a weapon, signed a final will, and joined a heavily armed convoy called a caravan, knowing that a significant percentage of the people who set out on the trail would never return. They would be swallowed by shifting sandstorms, frozen alive in high-altitude blizzards, or slaughtered by roving bands of nomadic raiders who viewed merchants as walking treasure chests. The horror of the Silk Road began with the absolute physical geography of the terrain. The route forced travelers through some of the most extreme, inhospitable landscapes on the planet. If you traveled the northern branch, you were forced to skirt the edges of the Taklamakan Desert, a name that literally translates from local languages to "you go in, you don't come out." It was a vast sea of shifting, massive sand dunes where water holes were separated by days of forced marching under a blistering sun, and where a single strong wind could erase the track completely, leaving an entire caravan hopelessly lost to die of dehydration. If you survived the desert, the path immediately forced you to scale the roof of the world, the brutal Pamir and Tian Shan mountain ranges. Here, the temperature plummeted from desert heat to sub-zero freezes in a matter of hours. The trails were nothing more than narrow, icy ledges carved into the faces of vertical cliffs, where a single misstep by a pack animal meant losing your entire life's fortune or your life into a bottomless ravine below. To cross these regions, you had to surrender your human rights to the elements. There were no rescue teams, no emergency shelters, and absolutely no turning back. The moment the city walls faded behind you, the natural world became a merciless predator, and the floating cage of the caravan became your only hope of survival in a hostile wilderness. If the physical exhaustion of the trail did not break a traveler's spirit, the terrifying psychological phenomena of the deep desert frequently did. As caravans pushed into the interior of the Taklamakan, merchants were subjected to intense sensory deprivation. The landscape was a silent, endless monotony of yellow sand and blinding sun glare. Under these conditions, travelers regularly experienced vivid auditory and visual hallucinations, a condition medieval writers recorded with genuine horror. Merchants would swear they heard the voices of their wives and children calling out to them from just over the next dune, or the distinct ringing of camel bells from a ghostly caravan that wasn't there. Those who succumbed to these phantom voices and stepped off the established track to investigate were instantly turned around in the shifting dunes, never to be seen again. When the sun finally set, bringing a freezing drop in temperature, the only hope for shelter was a caravanserai. These were fortified mud-brick roadhouses spaced roughly one day's travel apart, about 20 miles. Built like small desert fortresses, they were designed to keep raiders out, but inside, they were a squalid, claustrophobic nightmare. A traveler would enter a central courtyard packed with hundreds of braying, stressed camels, horses, and donkeys defecating in the enclosed space. The guest rooms were tiny, unventilated stone cells radiating the trapped heat of the day or freezing in the night. There were no beds. Merchants slept on the hard floor on their own carpets, surrounded by strangers from a dozen different lands, keeping one hand on their daggers to prevent their goods from being slit open and stolen while they slept. The atmosphere in these roadhouses was a thick, suffocating soup of animal sweat, dung fires, and unwashed human bodies that had been baking in the desert sun for weeks. The spaces were permanently plagued by three distinct miseries. But if the living quarters tested a man's sanity, the daily food on the trail was an exercise in pure survival. On a journey lasting months between major oasis cities, carrying fresh food was a physical impossibility. The diet was defined by industrial preservation and structural portability. The absolute staple of every meal was naan, a heavy, dense flatbread baked with as little moisture as possible so it would not mold. After weeks in a camel pack, the bread became as hard as a river stone. To eat it without shattering your teeth, a traveler had to smash it with a rock or soak it in a bowl of boiling, brackish water or mutton fat broth until it softened into a gray, unappealing mush. Accompanying the stale bread was dried meat, often strips of salted mutton, camel, or horse flesh that had been dehydrated until it was as tough as boot leather. To make it remotely digestible, it had to be boiled for hours over a fire fueled by dried camel dung, which imparted a bitter, smoky, and foul taste to everything it cooked. Water was an even greater hazard than hunger. Kept in heavy, unlined goatskin bags slung across the sides of pack animals, the water quickly took on the gamey, oily taste of the animal hide. Under the intense desert heat, the stagnant water became a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. When a merchant poured his daily, strictly rationed cup, the fluid was often lukewarm, green with algae, and swimming with larvae. Drinking it was a dangerous gamble. Dysentery and waterborne illnesses were rampant along the Silk Road. A severe case of diarrhea in the middle of a desert crossing wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an absolute death sentence, as the dehydration would claim a man's life within 48 hours, while the caravan, unable to delay, was forced to leave him behind to die in the sand. Even if your sanity survived the hallucinations of the deep desert, and your stomach tolerated the rancid rations of the caravanserai, the moment you began to ascend into the high-altitude mountain passes, you entered a completely new realm of physical torture. To bridge the gap between the markets of China and the trading hubs of Central Asia, caravans were forced to scale the treacherous Pamir and Tian Shan mountain ranges. The merchants appropriately dubbed these routes the hanging passages. The trails were not roads, they were narrow, icy ledges barely 2 feet wide, violently carved into the faces of vertical slate cliffs. On one side was a wall of solid ice and sheer rock, on the other, a straight drop of thousands of feet into a churning mountain river. Pack animals, heavily overloaded with bolts of silk, crates of porcelain, and bags of spices, frequently lost their footing on the slick ice. When a camel or horse slipped, it didn't just fall, it plummeted into the abyss, taking a merchant's entire life savings down with it. Furthermore, the air at these altitudes was so thin that both humans and animals suffered from severe, unmitigated mountain sickness. Travelers recorded feeling a permanent, crushing pressure in their skulls, a sensation as though their heads were being squeezed in an iron vise. Every single step required a monumental effort of will. Men would vomit violently, their noses and ears would bleed spontaneously from the atmospheric pressure, and an overwhelming, lethargic fatigue would settle over the limbs. The weather in these passes was notoriously volatile. A caravan could be marching under a clear sky one moment and wrapped in a blinding, sub-zero blizzard the next, because the merchants had spent the previous weeks sweating in the desert. Their wool robes were often damp with perspiration. The moment the mountain freeze hit, that moisture turned to a sheet of ice against their skin. Hypothermia claimed thousands of lives along these high ridges. If a traveler sat down on a rock to rest his aching legs for just 5 minutes, the frostbite would take hold, his core temperature would plummet, and he would simply never wake up again. To make matters worse, the mountains were highly unstable. The rhythmic, heavy thud of hundreds of camel hooves against the frozen earth could easily trigger a massive avalanche. Tons of cascading snow, ice, and jagged boulders would roar down the mountainside without warning, completely wiping an entire section of the convoy off the cliff face. The skeletons of dead travelers and the frozen, mummified remains of pack animals lined the sides of the paths, serving as grim, mile-by-mile markers for those who followed. There was no time for funerals or burials. If you died in the mountains, your companions would simply strip your body of its weapons and valuables, push your corpse over the ledge into the ravine to clear the path, and keep marching. If you survived the high-altitude mountain passes and descended back into the valleys, your nightmare was far from over. You now entered the domain of the most terrifying human threat on the Silk Road, the bandits. The vast spaces between the great empires were a geopolitical vacuum. No single government could afford to police thousands of miles of wilderness, meaning that large swaths of Central Asia were ruled entirely by the law of the sword. Roving bands of nomadic raiders, such as the Xiongnu, White Huns, or specialized regional brigands, viewed the trade routes as a permanent harvesting ground. They were expert horsemen, capable of launching lightning-fast ambushes out of the desert dust or rocky ravines, raining down iron-tipped arrows on a convoy before the merchants could even draw their swords. To survive, travelers were forced to invest heavily in self-defense, turning their commercial expeditions into private armies. No one traveled alone. Merchants pooled their resources to hire mercenary guards, heavily armed with composite bows, spears, and scimitars. When a caravan stopped for the night in the open wilderness, they would arrange their hundreds of camels in a massive, defensive circle, creating a makeshift wooden and leather fortress. Guards would patrol the perimeter in shifts, staring out into the pitch-black night, listening for the faint sound of horse hooves that signaled an impending raid. But the threat wasn't always hidden in the shadows. Frequently, it was institutionalized. Every few days, the caravan would encounter a mud-brick fortress or an outpost marking the territory of a local warlord or petty king. These rulers operated what was essentially a legal extortion racket. They demanded exorbitant protection money and transit tariffs just to let the caravan pass through their lands unharmed. If a merchant refused to pay the bribe or tried to smuggle his goods past the checkpoint, the consequences were brutal. The warlord's soldiers would seize the entire cargo, slaughter the mercenary guards, and throw the merchants into deep, vermin-infested pit dungeons to rot, or sell them directly into the regional slave markets. Furthermore, you could never fully trust the people within your own convoy. A multi-year journey under conditions of extreme stress, hunger, and fear was a breeding ground for psychological breakdown and betrayal. As the months wore on, desperate mercenaries might decide that murdering their employers and stealing a crate of jade or a bag of gold coins was far more lucrative than defending them for a meager wage. You slept with one eye open, knowing that the man sharing your campfire tonight could very well be the man who slits your throat tomorrow morning for a single bolt of silk.